Most of you, not all of you should have been paying attention and know Fabian Hamilton, know of him, MP for Leeds North East for how many years?
27th year.
27th year, right, so that's quite a while. And I've always been a supporter for CND and for peace work. Unfortunately, as we showed in the slideshow, he lost the role of Peace and Disarmament Shadow Minister, but still supporting us, and we support him for the work he can do to promote peace, basically, in the years to come. So thank you very much, Fabian.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me this afternoon. It's lovely to see so many people here on a cold Saturday afternoon in January in this wonderful building. Thank you for coming from York and other parts of West Yorkshire. And thank you to all those that I know personally, which is many of you. I'm going to just mention briefly, Dave, the Shadow Peace and Disarmament role, but I don't want to dwell on it too much, but for a number of reasons. Firstly, I don't think it's a good idea to talk about myself. I want to talk about the issues and how we collectively can resolve some of those issues if we put our heads together and if there's the political will. Secondly, I think looking back is helpful in terms of history and education, but we need to learn the lessons from what's gone past in order to deal with what's facing us in the future and the challenges ahead. So I don't want to dwell too much on it, but I will tell you just a little bit, because I think it puts in context the work that I'm doing and that I'm continuing to do, and that I hope to continue if I'm re-elected to Parliament at the general election sometime in the next 12 months. We don't know when, and I don't have any special knowledge about that. So let me start just by reminding you that in October, not November as it says in Wikipedia, but in October of 2016, I received a phone call from Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, saying, Fabian, I've got a new job for you. I was already on the front bench doing shadow ministerial work for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. And Jeremy said, I've got this new role. It's called Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament. It doesn't exist in government, but I think it's the way ahead. And I want you to take it on because of your support for CND, especially parliamentary CND, and all the work you've done over the years on peace, disarmament work, being a member of the Committee on Arms Export Control when I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and so on. And I want you to be on the Foreign Affairs, the Foreign Office team and the Defence team. And I was a bit kind of alarmed at this because I'm not really a military person, don't know much about the military, but he wanted me to be there to deal especially with defence diversification, because the TUC had just passed the resolution calling for defence diversification investment and a committee to look at how the skills, the money, the investment, the knowledge, the technology that currently goes into manufacturing weapons can be diverted into peaceful and planet-saving technologies and work, industries, business, etc. So the very things that are the money, the taxpayers' money, the cash that comes in from the private sector into weapons, both mass destruction and more relevantly in a way, weapons that kill people every single day, as we see on our TV screens all the time, can actually be directed to saving life, saving the planet, saving the environment, and actually peaceful ends. So that was a really good brief. The problem was that the Shadow Defence Secretary at the time didn't really want me to talk about that because obviously her role was to support the armed forces. I got involved with writing the bones of what we called a peace, a sort of, I suppose, I mean, we kind of called it, well, we looked at a comprehensive set of policies that would bring in peace and disarmament as the overriding aim of a Labour government that would want to not disarm the country, although I wouldn't be against that. I shouldn't say things like that because I got into trouble for saying that about getting rid of nuclear weapons a few years ago. But the point is that all licences should be accountable to Parliament, that we should have a say as MPs in whether we want to sell these weapons to certain countries before they're actually sold rather than afterwards. And more importantly, that our brilliant armed forces, who are there to defend this country in case of aggression and attack, could be there and are there to help create peace and post-conflict resolution in countries that have suffered too much from conflict and war. And I said that because they are trusted by all the countries I visit. People say, you're British troops. They don't seem to be here to kill people. They're actually very good at organising and keeping warring factions apart, and actually we trust them. They're not corrupt. They don't want to kill us. They don't want to subdue us. They just want us to get on better. And so they're trusted by many, many countries where British troops are present under blue hats. So that was the background. Couple of things before I go. What I wanted to do was just do a sort of tour d'horizon of some of the conflict zones at the moment, some of the things that we collectively can have an effect on by influencing our government, our MPs, our decision makers, by making a big noise about what we see around us that we are shocked and horrified at, beyond just going on demonstrations and saying this is wrong. But I think before I do that, just a couple of highlights of my time as Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament. I think the first was going in March 2017 to the United Nations for the initial discussions on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And Corbyn rang me up and said, I'd like you to go. And Emily Thornberry, who's Shadow Foreign Secretary, said, I think this is a good idea. And you just pay the fare and we'll refund you. They never did, by the way, but that's not the point, is it? So I went for 3 or 4 days and met quite a few people, including the New Zealand disarmament ambassador, the Austrians, the Jamaicans, the Irish, people who were very active in getting together all the countries that are members of the UN who wanted to see this treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. At the same time, on the day I arrived, you had Nikki Haley, the then US permanent representative to the United Nations, now allegedly a Republican candidate for presidency. I don't think she's going to get very far, together with the British permanent representatives at the time, Matthew Rycroft, and the French, standing outside the UN building saying, this is disgraceful, we're having no part of this treaty, it is an absolute affront to world peace, it will undermine, I know it's ironic, isn't it? It will undermine the non-proliferation treaty that's been so successful to date. And they put forward this false argument that the TPNW as it became would actually undermine the NPT and the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Complete nonsense, and there's no evidence whatsoever that that has happened or would have ever happened. So that was a real highlight, being steeped in the UN there and seeing what other countries outside the nuclear-armed countries and the NATO countries and the P5 on the Security Council were actually saying, thinking. Fast forward to December of 2017, when I get a phone call again from the leader's office saying, we want you to represent the Labour Party at the Nobel Prize Award in Oslo for ICANN, for the work they did getting the TPNW through. Was it 2017 or 2018? My brain is forgetting these things, but I was very proud to go. They paid for it this time. And I stayed in a hotel in Oslo, and I joined in and actually sat in the audience for this incredibly moving speech, which many of you will have seen, I think. Some of you might have been there. And when I got back, and it was really incredible, there was a sort of nighttime vigil afterwards in the cold, it's very cold in Oslo in winter, with candles and sort of flaming torches, and we marched through the centre of Oslo to celebrate this fantastic award for the Nobel Peace Prize. And I found out later that loads of people seemed to know I was there, and I said, why? And I said, well, when they focused in on the King and Queen of Norway, you were sitting right behind me. And we thought we recognised you, so nice to be famous at last. But it was a momentous occasion. Now we know we go forward to, let me just get my dates right, because I did write this down, but I don't want to get it wrong. So we go to the 22nd of January 2021, so almost 3 years now, when finally we get 50 ratifications of the treaty. And to date, I think I'm right in saying there are 93 signatories and 69 ratifications. Sure. So this treaty is an article of international law, and it's not before time. Now, is it going to get rid of nuclear weapons tomorrow? No. Is it going to be next year or in 100 years? Maybe. Probably not in my lifetime or yours, but we have to start somewhere. We know from history, with the treaties on chemical and biological weapons, on the NPT, on many of the other world's treaties, you plant a flag in the ground and say, from this moment onwards, we're going to campaign for this. And gradually over time, those weapons, those technologies, those methods of destruction and death and havoc become frowned upon by most of the world community. It doesn't stop chemical war, it doesn't stop, for example, Bashar al-Assad gassing his own population, or Saddam Hussein doing the same in Halabja. And it doesn't stop the British government selling precursor chemicals for sarin gas to the Syrians, claiming that they didn't know this is what it was going to be used for, because they thought it was going to be used in the production of state-run toothpaste. That's what we were told on the Committee on Arms Export Control in 2015. These chemicals were sold because we were told by the Syrian government, state-owned Syrian companies, they were the chemicals needed to make up toothpaste. Now, I don't know enough about chemistry, you probably know a lot more about me, but we subsequently found out that they were the chemicals necessary for lethal gas, and that lethal gas was used in the horrific civil war in Syria. So that's another reason why we need proper accountability for our weapons sales. And then I go forward from there to last, let me just go, I wrote the date down, the 9th of March last year, when I went to Vienna to meet a number of organisations to discuss peace and disarmament. But I wanted to meet the International Atomic Energy Agency Secretary General. I'd met the previous one, Secretary General Amano, who was a Japanese guy who tragically died in office. And he was replaced by an Argentinian called Rafael Grossi. And I thought, how do I get to Rafael Grossi, a former diplomat, Argentinian ambassador to Austria? And my regional brief, while I was my last 2 years as shadow minister, I did nearly 8 years altogether. My regional brief was Latin America and the Caribbean, and I thought, hang on, he's Argentinian. And I know the Argentinian ambassador quite well. He's an absolutely lovely man, Javier Figueroa, he's still there in London. So I rang him up and I said, do you know Rafael Grossi? He said, of course I know him, he's one of my best friends. And I said, do you think you could get me a meeting with him? Because obviously I'm not a head of state, a minister, a foreign minister, I'm not in government, I'm not actually very important in the world scheme of things, but I do stand up for the Labour Party's commitment to peace and disarmament, or at least certainly until September last year. And so Javier said, yes, I'll ring him up. And then 2 days later, I get a message saying, he'll see you at 6:45 on Thursday evening, the 9th of March. So we went along to the UN HQ in Vienna, and we were ushered straight into his office, and it was him, his assistant, me, and my staff member, just the 4 of us in the room. And it was absolutely fascinating. Because what we got was an insight from the man who is responsible for ensuring that the Non-Proliferation Treaty continues and that the countries that have signed up to it actually abide by its obligations. And he told us some quite hair-raising things. One of them was, for example, that he'd had Ibrahim Raisi, the president of Iran, sitting in this chair I was sitting in, telling him that they were quite anxious to sign up to the JCPOA, again, you know, the nuclear agreement between the West and Iran. But they didn't trust the West, who could blame them. They didn't trust the 3+3, but they did trust Rafael Grossi, because he was neither on their side nor on the side of the Western powers. And so he was somebody they would trust. And if he was in the room and an agreement was made, then that agreement they were sure would be adhered to. And it's interesting that the Western powers that were so anxious to get the JCPOA up and running after Trump left office had gone quite cold on it. And at the moment they'd gone cold on it, the Iranians decided it was in their interest to come back in with that agreement. Where it's got to now, I don't know. A lot of it's back channels and behind the scenes. I hope one day we'll get an announcement, but it's looking increasingly unlikely right now. But it was fascinating that this man was trusted by all parties. There are very, very few individuals. The other thing he told us was that, again, sitting in the chair I was sitting several weeks before, was Vladimir Putin.
Wow.
And exactly. So I thought I'd sort of check the chair first to see if it was Putin was talking about Zaporizhia in Ukraine. And Grozny said to him, you are going to have to stop your troops bombarding Zaporizhia because it is so critical now. We don't have a view as to who should run it. But the point is, it's a nuclear energy facility. It's a reactor. And if you blow that reactor up, it'll be far worse than Chernobyl. And it won't just pollute the soil and the countryside and kill everything in sight immediately, but it'll be there for not just generations, but for thousands of years, including parts of your country, Russia, that will also suffer. I said, well, what did Putin say? He went, he didn't say anything. He just raised his hands like that. So that's extremely worrying, but it's an insight into the importance of organisations like the International Energy Agency. I'm going to just speed up a little bit because I'm going to take far too long with my anecdotes. So let me go to, I'm going to mention Israel-Gaza in a minute, and I know that we at CND have had quite a bit to say about it, but I want to mention another conflict which has been, in many ways, even more tragic than what's happening in Gaza and Palestine at the moment, and that's the Yemen civil war. Now, we don't see it on our TV screens anymore. We didn't see enough when it was on the TV screens. But remember, it started officially, and there were rumblings and conflict and killings and bombings before this, on the 16th of September 2013. Now, there has been an official ceasefire since the 2nd of April 2022, although there are still incursions and obviously weapons being used. But during that time, Houthi rebels now control almost all of former northern Yemen. And the UN estimates that 377 people have been killed. 377,000 people have been killed, with 85,000 children dying from starvation between 2015 and 2018. 4 million people displaced. 4,000 have died so far from cholera. It's widely regarded, of course, as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, even though the Iranians and the Houthis deny that there's any link between them. It's quite clear that there is. And I had a confidential briefing while I was still Shadow Minister from the Foreign Office officials about what the Houthis are actually doing and how they're funded and how they organise. And if you think the Taliban are bad or IS are bad, these people are just as bad. They're brutal, they're vicious, and they stand absolutely no argument from the population that they now control. And yet we hear nothing about this. We rightly hear about the 22,000 civilians who've been killed in Gaza, which is a tragedy beyond imagination, and it's heartbreaking. But why do we not hear, and why do we not do something as a world community about Yemen? Is a Yemeni life worth any less than a Palestinian or an Israeli life? All lives are equal, and I find it just shocking and appalling. But we can, I think, do something about this if we have the political will. And the UK is lucky because we are still on the permanent members of the Security Council. Why, I really don't know, but we are. So we need to use that and try and stop this horror. Martin Griffiths, who was the UN rapporteur on Yemen, because we were what's called the pen holders, so it was our responsibility to do something as the United Kingdom, did what he could. But the accounts I've read is that Martin Griffiths, a British citizen and a former British diplomat, was so frustrated with the government and the lack of interest from the various foreign secretaries we've had over the last 6 or 7 years that he actually gave up the brief and went to the United Nations General Secretary and said he couldn't do this anymore because the British were actually not really bothering. So we have blood on our hands, I think. It's easy to say that we have blood on our hands in Israel, Palestine, Gaza, but this is far, far worse. And that doesn't make one better than the other or one worse than the other. The bloodshed has to stop, and it has to stop now. And I would like to see people being as vocal about Yemen as they are about Ukraine or about Gaza, and they're right to be vocal about those things. So, I'm painting a gloomy picture. Let me just say something about Ukraine, and I will say something a little bit more uplifting. So Ukraine. The invasion took place, as you remember, on the 24th of February 2022, so it's coming up for its second anniversary. Russia invaded Ukraine, escalating, of course, their initial invasion of 2014. It was the largest attack on any European country since World War II. Now, not long after that invasion, I had a very interesting meeting with David Haney, who was once our permanent representative at the United Nations and a British diplomat. He's a crossbench peer now in the House of Lords, together with former Conservative Defence and Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind and Malcolm Chalmers of the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, I think, anyway, or maybe he's at Rossi. Anyway, he used to be one of the committee experts for this International Development Committee that I sat on from 2013 to 2016. Very good academic. But what they were saying was fascinating. And I can maybe answer questions on this if you're interested, but they were talking about the appalling corruption in Russia at the moment and how that's impacted on their ability to carry out a conflict. Now, the big advantage Russia has is it's so enormous and it's got a huge population compared with Ukraine, which is, although it's a big country, it's relatively small compared with Russia. So they've got this sort of overwhelming might. It's how they defeated the Nazis, how Stalin defeated the Nazis. Just send the population in to be mown down, and eventually, you will overcome. And they did, because they withstood the siege. And many of us will have read Stalingrad or seen the film based on it, Enemy at the Gates. It's horrifying that human life counts for absolutely nothing. But I'm afraid this is still the attitude of many of the leaders of modern Russia. But some of the things we were told by Haney, by Chalmers and by Rifkin were absolutely extraordinary, actually, in a modern day country not very far from us, which is Russia today. Let me just, it's interesting, actually, the other thing before I leave Ukraine is that, yes, the war is grinding on. And I think we're right to support the Ukrainians, but, and I know Martin will come in on this, but many of you will too, but where are the efforts for negotiation? Where are the efforts to stop the death, the destruction, the horrors that are going on? And of course we'll have massive sympathy with a population, with a country, with citizens, with people who suddenly find their country being invaded and being told, in spite of all the treaties that have been signed and concluded over the years since the end of the Soviet Union, that actually they're still part of Russia, and they always have been, and they always should be, and you don't have a right to democracy or freedom of speech or the rule of law. You do what you're damn well told by the leader of Russia, who's utterly corrupt, and the leader of a country where, well, he's the richest person in Russia, is Putin, by far. It really is a kleptocracy. So I think we're right to support the Ukrainians, but why are they any more important than the Yemenis? And here's another conflict that we haven't heard much about, Nagorno-Karabakh. And most people won't know where it is even. Now obviously everybody in this room is pretty well read and educated, but it was a little corridor between, a little sort of promontory out of Armenia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it was a disputed territory for decades actually. They called it a frozen conflict. And in September of last year, I've written it down somewhere. In September of last year, the Azerbaijan military basically surrounded the enclave and forced the Armenian population to leave. And so 140,000, I think it was, actually no, I think it's more like 400,000. No, it's the entire population actually left the region for Armenia, even though it had been their home for many, many decades or longer. And on the 1st of January, just a few days ago, the former breakaway Republic of Artsakh was formally dissolved. And that is the end of Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict there. Solved by military force. Thousands of people displaced, moving. They didn't want to move, being forced to leave their homes and the country that they knew as their own for so long. There has to be a better way, doesn't there? So what is that better way? I think we have to reform the United Nations. I mean, that's absolutely essential. I wonder whether, and I'll probably be shot down by the Daily Mail and others for saying this, it's too late, I already have been, but should Britain still be a P5 member? Should France still be a P5 member? Should it be might is right? Should it be the largest countries in the world, the biggest economies currently? Obviously China and the US are two of them, but India is also a pretty massive economy these days, and so is Brazil. Should they not have a say? Should it be a rotating membership, which I think it should? I mean, there are non-permanent members of the Security Council that are rotating, and you often get countries like Jamaica, for example, a small island in a way. But we have to look at that. And I think one of the priorities for the next government, because let's face it, this government is not competent to do anything, let alone international relations, should be a discussion, a serious discussion about the reform of the United Nations. Now, when I was in the shadow team, Lord Collins, was given the task by David Lammy, Shadow Foreign Secretary, of looking into how the UN should be restructured and what our proposals should be as a Labour government if we win the next election. And I think that's absolutely right. I haven't seen the final proposals yet, and I probably won't be party to them now I'm not in the team anymore. But that's where we have to start. Now, the second thing is that our armed forces, as I mentioned earlier, could be an extraordinary force for good and for peace. And the Daily Mail last July took me to task because I suggested that British armed forces could be like a peace force, a peace police force, if you like, only by invitation, not forced or imposed on other countries, but where those countries feel that they need an outside organisation with the strengths that a military force has, a strength to organise. You know, it's no coincidence that the military was sent in when Ebola became a huge crisis in West Africa, a very, very dangerous, fast-spreading disease for which there's pretty well no cure, where you need rigid organisation to ensure that you stop the contamination and the spread of a disease like that. Obviously, Martin, you're the expert in things like that, but I'm probably talking nonsense. But a military structured organisation that can actually do things and save life is the most important thing. So why can't our armed forces be trained not only to defend our country against aggression and attack and invasion, but be there to help other countries in the world not just maintain peace, but create the preconditions for peace and then make sure that peace works, stopping the conflict? Because it becomes clearer and clearer to me by the day that conflicts like Gaza and Hamas grew up. I mean, I think they're abhorrent, and if there were Hamas people in the room, they'd kill me first as a Jew. Never mind, I wouldn't ask questions. So I have no time for people like that, but we have to understand what it is that bred that kind of horrific terrorism. And the inequalities, the iniquities, the oppression over decades must play a part in that. It must have done. And it's no coincidence that the last time I went to Gaza, which was a few years ago now, the services that people expect from their local government, from their national government, were not provided by the Palestinian Authority or Fatah, they were provided by Hamas. And when we went through the crossing from Israel, southern Israel near Sderot, into Gaza itself, our passports were inspected, we were searched by the Israeli military and then by the Palestinian Authority officials, and then we had to present our passport to the Hamas officials. So that's, they were the people that provided the educational opportunities, the day-to-day, the rubbish collection, the food distribution, the health services, the social services. They were absent otherwise. They were, if you like, the state. And those civil servants that work for them, who are not necessarily supporters of Hamas or terror, probably not, are still there. And if we're going to see Gaza rebuilt, let's just remind ourselves about Gaza, because I found this quite astonishing, and I have been there, as I say. We know that 3,000 fighters invaded on the 7th of October last year, and 1,139 Israeli citizens were killed that day. To date, around 22,000 Palestinians have died. Nobody really knows the number because of all the rubble and all the bombs and the explosions and the missiles. But they're mostly civilians and mainly children killed by the retaliatory invasion and bombardment. Gaza is a strip of land, 141 square miles, that was home to 2.3 million people. Let's compare that with where we are now, Leeds. Greater Leeds, boundaries of the local authority, 213 square miles and 810,000 people. We're quite a dense city in places. I know we've got lots of countryside too. But that brings it home, doesn't it? Gaza is smaller than Leeds. Its population is 3 times as great. So look, back to what we can do, and I'll conclude on this because I've told you what I've done, what I've seen. There's lots more to say, and I'll probably have to write it down one day. But for the purposes of our conversation this afternoon, because I want you to get a chance to ask me any points you want to ask. The other major thing is on weapons sales. Now, we utterly failed on trying to find a way of taking the investment in weapons manufacturing into civilian and life-saving technologies. Defence diversification never got off the ground. It should do. The TUC still supports it very strongly, although some of the member unions, like the GMB, do not support it because their members' jobs are at risk. But I'm absolutely sure if you were the workers at Bruff, for example, at BAE Systems, and I was sat there with the TUC officials, and we could persuade you that the rates you got paid for the jobs you were doing making weapons would be just as good in the civilian sector, saving the planet, saving lives, enhancing lives. I don't think that's a difficult argument, frankly. You've got some very highly skilled, thoughtful and educated people there. So, how do we do that? Well, one of the policies I managed, one of the few successes I managed as Shadow Minister for Peace, was to get through our party policy-making body, a policy whereby we created the Committee on Arms Export Control, currently not a select committee. This is very bureaucratic, but we made it into a proper select committee. So select committees in the House of Commons are elected by their party groups, and the chair is elected by all MPs. And they get an extra salary, not a lot, but they get an extra salary, but they get staff, and they are independent of the government and of outside influence. So we got that through. So a Labour government will create a new select committee that's non-departmental, that is the Committee on Arms Export Control, as it's currently called, and it will be there to look at licence applications. The other thing we succeeded on was the idea that a licence for export should not be granted unless the applicant could prove that the end user was reliable, was a state body, and the weapons would not be used to kill or oppress its own population. And then, so the assumption would be that you don't allow the licences. Now, the industry will be really against this, because it will actually impact on their sales. For me, I would rather we didn't manufacture any weapons at all, except for our own defence. But that's a very minority view, and I've had that kicked in my face again by the Daily Mail in years gone by. But I know it sounds like a bureaucratic policy, but in a way that will totally turn on its head the current system whereby our weapons are sold to state actors, sometimes going to non-state actors. There's very little follow-up, and the licenses are assumed to have been granted as long as certain conditions are fulfilled, and off those weapons go from UK factories. I don't think that's good enough. And as we always said, our weapons are our responsibility, and we have to be really responsible. If we're going to manufacture them and export them, we have to be really responsible as to who gets them. I'd rather they didn't. Nuclear weapons, I think you all know my views on that. Trident is proving to be exactly what we in CND said it would be, a complete white elephant, frankly. And it's just more and more money for something that is completely out of date and so dangerous that its use could destroy the entire globe. But how do we actually persuade the UK government, hopefully a progressive government, to sign the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons? Well, let's not give up on it just yet. If my party wins, let's try and make sure that CND and anybody else who does not want to see proliferation of nuclear weapons has a strong and loud voice. And I think we can persuade a government that this is not in the interests of the United Kingdom and the people of the UK. And I actually don't know about you, but I think that the public out there are ahead of the politicians. Because I think most people think, why are we spending £100 billion on a weapons system that, if it's ever used, would be the death of all of us, including the planet, when we could spend it on the things we really desperately need? Saving the environment, saving the planet, but making life tolerable for the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of UK citizens, for a start, that actually don't have enough to live on or decent accommodation. Just think what we could do with a fraction of that money in public health, in the environment, and in environmentally friendly housing that was cheap to rent or to purchase. And the energy that would save, and therefore the carbon emissions that would save. A fraction of that 100 billion would solve many of the problems that the people of our country face. And another fraction of it could go back to the 0.7% of GDP, which is too little, that we spend on overseas development assistance, ODA, which we have to restore and use it much more wisely, because that money was a lifeline to so many communities, villages and towns in the developing world, and its withdrawal has caused real suffering, and I've seen that myself. I'm going to stop there actually, then, so people can ask what they want to ask. But thank you for listening. I'm sorry if I ran.
So over to you. Questions? Yeah.
That's great. Starting with what you've been saying just in the last bit of your talk, if we could have getting rid of the nuclear deterrent as part of the whole programme, could we not look also at what you mentioned about us being a member of the P5? Because I think the whole thing about us having a nuclear weapon is because we still think we're a great power, and we still have a permanent place in the UN organisation, and that people listen to us. And I think France is the same idea of itself. Can that bubble not somehow be pricked? Because I think unless that bubble is actually got rid of, we'll always have nuclear power and nuclear weapons, because people think we have to because we're a great power.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Sorry, can I just make a note of your name, Simon?
David.
Thanks, David.
Do you want to take a few questions?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Miriam, yeah.
Excuse me, I'm looking at the issues what you're talking about, the proposal to regulate weapons exports, and I think we can all agree it's a good idea, but the things that have been tried before and they haven't been particularly efficacious. The obvious problem is that state actors only, some state actors can be involved. I won't consult anybody's political intelligence for suggesting examples of that. Also, there's a question of to what degree you can guarantee, and I suspect that will be subject to the internal and possibly Foreign Office biases of any particular government, and that needs to be overcome. Of course, the third one, which I appreciate you haven't discussed and you may not wish to, we've got the use of cyber weaponry. Yeah. Is that included, and can that be fitted in? Because that's a huge issue. And I'm not going to start talking about Israel and Palestine, although I could do that, but we just take it perhaps within the UK context and ask if that's included in the framework and whether any additional safeguards are necessary.
Thank you.
One more from Kath?
Yeah, excuse me, I've got two questions. The first one goes back to the beginning of what we were talking about the policies that you said you'd worked on under Jeremy Corbyn to work towards a more peaceful world. You've mentioned the one about the arms control. I just wonder if any others of those policies that you put together still form part of the Labour Party's policies or the upcoming manifesto or whatever. You know, are there anything that's carried on? And the second point, in relation to nuclear weapons specifically, I wondered if you had a view on whether the current shadow cabinet were either ethically or pragmatically actually in favour of nuclear weapons, and why? Because it does feel like we're at a point now where, for quite a few generations, it does feel like this general election is going to be a shoo-in for the Labour Party. So I don't understand why the manifesto doesn't seem like it's going to be as radical as it could be, bearing in mind the current predictions.
Sorry, what was your name? Sorry.
Catherine.
Catherine, thanks, Catherine.
Do you want to take those to start with?
Shall I take those? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Well, let me start, Catherine, if I may. Let me go backwards. Let me start with the very important points. So I think many of the policies under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership have been ditched. There is... Somebody said to me recently, and you probably all heard this, that it's almost like you're carrying a priceless Ming vase from across a room. And if you trip up, you break it, and that's gone. And that's almost the kind of false analogy in a way, but that's being used about this election. Yes, we're shoo-in to win, but you never take these things for granted. And it only takes one real messy trip up to turn the tide. Now that's what the leaders think. I think they're being far too cautious and timid, actually. I would have thought now is the time to not necessarily have all the policies that Jeremy put in the 2019 manifesto and his team, because in a way they were far too ambitious and broad. And it was almost like you can have a perfect world tomorrow and free internet. And that just nobody believed it. But what you could do, I think, is be a little less cautious. Now, one of the reasons, I don't want this to be about me, but I will mention this. One of the reasons I think that I was sacked because my job was abolished. And I'm the only person who's ever done that job. I was hoping that wouldn't be the case. And it's because the Daily Mail had I hate the Daily Mail, and many people do, but it had a campaign, a relentless campaign, against the role I had and what I was doing in that role. And I think some bright spark in the leader's office, because no one individual can carry this much knowledge in his or her head, thought, you know what, this is another one of those potential trip-ups for that Ming vase. Let's just get rid of it. So when I got the phone call saying, you're out of a job, not that it was a paid job, of course, I was told, we've abolished the role of peace and disarmament, and therefore you've got nothing to do. I said, well, you do realise that most of my time is spent in the regional brief, because the regional brief is more pressing because there are things happening all the time. And although Latin America, thankfully, has no actual conflicts, it's got plenty of problems. There's no actual wars going on right now in Latin America, the continent. They seem to have no idea that I was doing that. Now, either somebody's being disingenuous, or they just thought, get rid of this Hamilton guy, because he's trouble. And this peace and disarmament, it's a bit like something out of Corbyn's era. And they want nothing to do with Corbyn. So Corbyn is now regarded as totally toxic. And anything associated or anyone associated is toxic. So I think that probably explains why they're being super overcautious. I do hope that the 28 billion that's we've said we would spend each year on making our economy greener and saving the planet does not go out of the window, because it's a very important commitment. The GB Energy idea is one of the best ideas we've had. I don't think it's really hit the public consciousness yet, but this idea that the state sets up an electricity generating company where taxpayers' money go into the capital infrastructure, and every kilowatt hour of electricity you use is generated through renewable sources and not for profit. And it's owned by the state. It's a brilliant way of undermining the huge profiteering by some of the energy companies that are currently making a fortune out of all of us under the banner that, there's a Ukraine war going on. That's quite a radical idea, and it's just really important that some of the better ideas stay there. Whether there's going to be more radicalism in the manifesto, well, I don't have a say anymore, I'm afraid. Didn't have much of a say then. But I think it's a good point. The bureaucratic committee stuff probably will stay in because nobody gives a damn about it, and nobody really understands what it's all about. But yes, there is a problem. So I'll just go back through what Miriam said. On the regulation of weapons exports. Yes, state actors are unreliable. If you're reliant just on Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office views about whether a country's government can be trusted to buy British weapons, it's probably not the best way of doing it. So I suspect that any such select committee would have to have its own way of verifying whether those countries are safe to sell weapons. I'd rather we didn't sell them to anybody. In my own personal view, for what it's worth, this is a personal view, not a Labour Party view, would be if we have to make weapons, we make them to defend our country and our people, and that's it. We don't export them. When I said that Ed Freudian slip there, while Ed Miliband was leader of the party, one of his people said, "Oh, well, Fabian Hamilton doesn't speak for the Labour Party." This is when I was on the backbenches. His is a very fringe view. We don't subscribe to that view. But actually, when you think about it, it's quite an important point, isn't it? that if you're going to make weapons, because let's be clear, you're putting a lot of human effort, ingenuity, intelligence, research, finance into manufacturing things that kill people. And that's their only raison d'etre. Now, yesterday, I went to a factory in Derby that makes trains. And I saw the best of human ingenuity and intelligence. The way they made lighter, more efficient, more energy efficient, and ultimately, carbon neutral vehicles for public transport, using the latest electronics, the latest materials, the latest research into sort of frictionless travel. Absolutely brilliant. And that factory that employs 3,600 people may well close in the next 2 months because of British government policy. Now, we're doing our best to try and save it. But I make that point because if we put half the resources we put into creating products that kill people into trains or public transport that was energy efficient or carbon neutral, well, wouldn't that be fantastic? And the jobs would still be there. So that's my view for what it's worth. Now, you made the very important point about cyber weapons. And I mean, it's something I don't know enough about. The expert, or the person that knows a lot about it, is interestingly a man called Des Brown. And I don't think anybody remembers Des Brown. He was Defence Secretary under Gordon Brown and I think briefly under Tony Blair. He's a Scottish lawyer, a very bright guy, now in the House of Lords. But he's had a sort of moment in his travel along life's highway when he suddenly realised, having been a strong advocate of nuclear weapons, that they were a really bad idea. And this is the man whose job was to promote and protect them, Britain's so-called independent nuclear deterrent. And this comes, I'm touching on what David said now. His view is we should get rid of them as quickly as possible. And one of the reasons for that is that cyber warfare is now so advanced in countries like Russia. And this is what I said a few years ago at a CND meeting in Brighton, a party conference, which I got into trouble for, that the control systems that control whether these horrible weapons can ever be used can be hacked into by Russian or other hackers. And that renders them completely useless. Now, a deterrent's only as good as the people that believe it will be used. If you know that that weapon is there but cannot be used because somebody else can control it, then it's no longer a deterrent because it's not a threat, because it's useless. What I said in Brighton a few years ago was that would be fine by me. I'm not going to say that today because that was misquoted and I was accused of treason. And told by the Defence Secretary I should be sent to jail for life for saying that. So I'm not saying it anymore. But this is how obscene and absurd parts of our national media are. But David, look, I had an argument with Nicolas Roche, who was the head of nuclear weapons policy for the Quai d'Orsay for the French Foreign Ministry. This was a few years ago. He came to London. He asked to meet with me through the French embassy. I do speak French, although actually his English is better than my French. My French is good. But he's a nuclear weapons expert, and he said, please, please, please do not, if you're a Labour government, do not give up the nuclear weapons. Because we don't want to be the only European power with nuclear weapons, and we're not giving them up anytime soon, and this is not a thing for the French public. Your British public might be a bit ambivalent about them, but the French public's solidly behind France's deterrent, for the very reasons you point out, that it gives us this great position on the world stage, that without them we're nobody. Well, I'm sorry, it's our values that should count, not our ability to buy American nuclear weapons technology and then be unable to use them because they've been hacked into by Russians or anybody else. Not North Koreans, take your pick. So the answer is education. And we absolutely have to get to a position where the British public is behind the view that we hold, that these weapons are so wicked and evil, so monstrous, that they should just not exist at all, and we should have no part in them. And all the resources of hard-earned cash by the British public, who are suffering hugely at the moment with the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis, should go into their welfare, not weapons that will never, hopefully, ever be used. God forbid if they are used, that's it. We've got to turn the tide on this. And I think it is turning. But we need to push that along. Because the longer this ludicrous idea continues, the worse. And coming back to what you said, I think, Catherine, I've had this discussion with John Healey, who I like a lot. He's a friend of mine. He's a fellow Yorkshire MP. He's Shadow Defence Secretary. But he seems to do what all Shadow Defence Secretaries seem to do, which is embrace the establishment and say, oh, I love the British Army. I love everything they stand for. I love all their wonderful moral view of the world. And Britain is safe in our hands. There's this fear. And it seems to me very often in our politics, especially as you move away from currently the far right, it is fear more than ideology, more than intelligence, more than moral values that controls what we do in the political arena. And I think that's got to change. Because why should we constantly be afraid of saying, this is common sense. This makes sense for everybody. This is about equality. And we know one of the biggest drivers, apart from climate change and water resources, of conflict in the world is inequality. And it's a conclusion I came to some time ago, especially when I was on the International Development Select Committee, that you see the terrible, terrible inequality around the world, and you think, I want to do something about it, and yet it's the driver of so much that's wrong in human society. But the answer's in our own hands. We can change it. And it's in the hands in a democratic system. It's in our hands as a democracy to elect those politicians and spokespeople who will be determined to change it. We just have to. Otherwise, there's just no future. I don't know how many people in this room have got grandchildren, but I've got 2 young grandchildren. I want them to have a planet to live on, a society that they can call home, a country that they can be proud of. Because in the end, human security is not about nuclear weapons. It's about whether people have got enough to eat and can share in the fruits of their own labour. Just as a statistic, so I'm rambling on a bit here, but just as an interesting statistic, I was looking at this morning because I was with the chief exec of Alstom Trains yesterday, and I wanted to know what he earned. I mean, he's a nice guy, don't get me wrong, he does a very good job, and he cares passionately about the 3,600 workers and the products they produce, but I wanted to know what he earned. And I couldn't find it anywhere, but I found out that the top FTSE 100 companies' chief executives collectively, on average, now earn just under £4 million a year. I say earn, but you don't earn £4 million a year. And that the comparator is in 2020, those executives were earning 78 times, from memory, what the average salary was in the UK, average wage, 30,000 a year. By 2021, that had gone up to 108 times. By 2022, 118 times. And it's gone up since then. So the disparity is like this. Inequality breeds conflict. Sorry, enough lecture.
We've got time for...
Yeah. I have as much time as you.
This is Hugh.
Yeah, Hugh, sorry. In 2006, we had CND had a FASAIM 365.
Yeah.
And I remember a talk you gave because you were part of a parliamentary commission.
What was well remembered.
And you'd been invited to go round the Trident submarine.
Certainly, yeah.
And the general, the officer said, we're going to show you this, and we're going to show you this wonderful piece of kit. It's better than the space program and so on.
Yeah.
And you will really change your mind. And of course you didn't.
Absolutely.
But what David highlighted in his report is that I think it's two of our Trident submarines are out of action.
Yeah.
And one nearly sank or nearly came to grief. Now, is the Labour Party actually prepared that it might be confronted by having a Trident system which doesn't work? And could it take that opportunity to actually say, okay, let's give up and join the TPNW? And can you do that in such a way? Because I know you have this idea of changing the UN, but I'm just thinking in practical purposes, if that arose, whether you could do that without inciting this fear from the mail and so on that we'd be off the P5, that sort of thing.
Okay, sorry, my pen's run out. Yeah, okay, I think I've got most of that.
Yeah.
Another phone.
There's a couple
Oh yeah,
more.
could you remember that? Sorry, that's really kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. You've mentioned three areas that interest me. Ceasefires at flashpoints, Ukraine, Palestine, Yemen. Two, international treaties, which you described, and then arms conversion and swords into ploughshares, all of which, what we do basically. My question is about the role of senior civil servants at places like the Treasury or the Foreign Office. Do you think they are a help or a hindrance? And is there scope for progress with talking to such people?
Thank you. Sorry, what was your name again? Sorry.
Peter Latham.
Oh, Peter.
Martin, and Colin.
Oh, sorry, Deborah. Go ahead, Martin.
Martin?
No.
Oh, Matt Martin. Sorry, no, Martin. Sorry. My apologies.
I do keep up with things, I keep up with conflicts elsewhere, whether it's Ansar and Gorno-Karabakh, or something in Myanmar and so on. I hadn't paid attention, I suppose, to Yemen, and wasn't aware of the position in relation to Houthi and the way they behaved, and so on. So my only, as it were, reactions within it were concerned with arms sales to Saudi Arabia, who were confronting them. And like you, I'm not in favour of arms sales to anybody. But in that context, what is it through a reformed United Nations that you would think that could be approached? In other words, I can't see a way forward clearly there. That if we're not supporting the people who are fighting the Houthis for good reason, then who will take action? How would action take place? And I didn't know if that's what was behind what you were saying about UN reform, or a peacekeeping force made up of our army.
Thanks. And was there some
Colin?
Very short
Oh,
one.
Colin, yeah. Thanks.
In your new exciting role on the backbenches, what are you going to put your priorities into? What's your new focus?
Okay, thanks. Well, I'll come to that last. So priorities.
And then Deborah.
Maybe I've got a suggestion for you. My name's Debbie. I was intrigued because you start very early, you mentioned defence diversification.
Yes.
And maybe other people are like me, trade unionists.
Yes.
And somebody here summed it up as arms conversion.
Yeah.
Like this whole idea, and the way that CND's tried to connect with green energy issues, and, the nuclear power and the nuclear bombs and so on. Maybe this is a campaign against the arms trade link with the defence diversification, and I'm reminded of the Lucas plan.
Yes.
There's something going on at the moment in GKN in Florence, where again, workers whose jobs are under threat, they want to produce, cargo bikes and, useful stuff.
Yeah.
And, so it's not just the bosses that know about this, but also the workers.
Yeah.
And maybe this is something, if some of us are in campaign against the arms trade, to sort of push that way. I was glad to hear it mentioned again, and then a bit disappointed when it went off into arms export controls, because that's something negative, well, in a way. And I like campaigns that have also got a positive side to them.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for that. So I'll try and be a bit quicker because I know we've got limited time. So, Hugh, well remembered on the Halifax Lane visit. My God, it's 18 years now, nearly. I know, I feel really old. And your recollection is fantastic. So the idea of the visit was by the Labour whips, actually, because we were in power, to convert us sceptics, into wanting to support this fantastic modernisation of our nuclear arms facilities. And you're right, they were showing us all this fabulous kit that they thought it was anyway. But two things came out of that. One was I felt far better educated to argue against them because I didn't know much about it until then. And I found out how it all worked and how it all fitted together and which elements of the equation were brought in from the USA, like the actual Trident vehicles themselves. and how therefore it could all be taken apart and how it was not independent. And I did doubt it's a deterrent, it certainly was nuclear. But we need the Americans' permission for everything, so thank you for reminding me of that. One of the things that came out of that I remember so strongly was the dinner we had with the mid-ranking naval officers the night before we got up at 5 in the morning to go on board the sub on the Clyde. By the way, the weather was far too bad to actually get on board, so we went on board one that was already docked. That was the officers saying, look, in the end, you're the politicians, you decide if we have nuclear weapons or not, and if you don't want them, we're just as happy to carry on doing what we do as naval officers and doing the best we can to defend the country. That's our role. But you decide on the weapons, and we carry out your wishes. So I thought that's really quite important, actually. And that comes into the question about civil servants. You said, is the party prepared to give up on Trident if the submarines cannot be fixed? I can't answer that, I don't know. It's now certainly above my pay grade. It would be something I would argue with John Healey and his team about if they become the ministers and the Secretary of State. If you can't fix these subs, don't sink ever more millions and billions of our hard-earned taxpayers' money into them. If they're useless, they're useless. Do something else. And actually, I said I'm not a great militarist, and I'm not. But why is it that the supposed party of the armed forces, i.e. the Tories, has shrunk our armed forces personnel to a level we haven't seen since the 1920s or 30s? It's quite bad, well actually before that. It's actually pretty bad. And it's ironic to me that Labour should be the party that says, well, we actually need to get up to strength, which is I think 80,000 armed forces personnel. I think we're below 60,000 at the moment. And that's not enough to defend the country. So, I mean, obviously if it was a war it would be different, but and I hope to goodness that never happens. But are we prepared to give up on Trident and sign the TPNW if those subs can't be repaired? Don't know. I doubt it very much, I'm afraid, for fear of opprobrium. Peter, thank you. You mentioned international treaties that I'd mentioned, ceasefires, arms conversion. What's the role of the civil servants? My pen ran out there. I think there are some really brilliant civil servants. Certainly the people I dealt with in the Foreign Office were of superb quality. Don't know about the defence officials particularly, but I would have thought, even in spite of the increased politicisation of the senior ranks of the civil service at the moment, there are so many good people. I'm very lucky in that there's 2 people I now know in the Foreign Office that worked briefly for me as students and did work experience. And one of them's now second secretary political in our embassy in Washington. She's immensely bright, educated here, of Albanian extraction. They have some remarkable people. And it seems to me the more educated and thoughtful they are, the more likely they are to want to carry out progressive policies. And the more they understand, I mean, that's not universally the case, as you know, Debbie. But there are some good people there. And if we decided politically we were going to carry out certain policies, i.e. disarmament or non-nuclear policies, they would carry them out. I'm absolutely sure of it. Now, your question was, should we be speaking to them? Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely. They won't do something that goes against the government of the day. But we've all seen Yes Minister, and we know the power of the power of civil servants to thwart politicians if they don't like what they're doing. Martin, thank you for raising Yemen again. I feel quite strongly about this. About 5 years ago, a really interesting independent journalist called Sue Turton did a dispatches programme for Channel 4, and she came to see me because I was doing Middle East at the time. She came to see me in the Commons. I didn't get quoted on it or anything. I didn't want to be. But she did this most extraordinary expose of the Ministry of Defence and the British government's involvement, not just in the arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but their involvement in the actual conflict. Because what she told me was that she'd interviewed Royal Saudi Air Force personnel and British Defence, Ministry of Defence officials who were working in Riyadh. And what came through was that the pilots of these sophisticated British and American fighter planes were all members of the royal family. And therefore they wouldn't be told what to do. And they wouldn't be told when to turn up. And they wouldn't be told how to be trained to fly these aircraft, except insofar as it was safe for them to take off. And they certainly wouldn't be told from the ground where to drop their payloads. And that's why so many schools and hospitals, we've heard it all about in Gaza, but that's why so many Yemeni schools and hospitals have been destroyed. It's because, I don't know much about conflict, but in a conflict, it's all controlled rigidly from the map room, as it were, or the digital equivalent. And these guys wouldn't listen to what they were told. They just said, no, I think that's a Houthi camp, I'm going to bomb it. And that's why there's disproportionate amounts of destruction. Now, your question was, who would actually take on that role if the Saudis weren't doing it? I mean, we have been really complicit in the death and destruction in Yemen, and yet the British public doesn't seem to know about that. I think if they knew what I knew and what most of us now know, they'd be just as horrified. It has to be. That's why we need the reform of the UN. I'm not saying the UN should become a world army or world police force, but let's face it, where do countries in conflict turn if they want a solution? Not necessarily to the Americans, although the Israelis might, but they turn to the UN. We have to empower the UN, don't we? Well, I don't know.
How do we start? I mean, that's my real point. That until we reform, the veto thing of the United Nations with the Gaza situation, it's just shown it's totally impotent, isn't it?
But
no matter what happens in the General Assembly.
You're right.
But to me, I can't see a way forward because my political party somehow, there must be someone within them. But I really am absolutely stuck. And I used to think the United Nations Association was sort of, but somehow, and there was a period of time when they really did do something about peace and disarmament for a very short period of time. And then they've stopped it now again. And it's only it's not a very well paid off charity is how they describe themselves now. So I'm at a total loss, and I really do believe until we somehow reform, and so many people don't see any value in the United Nations at all. They just paid up members of the elite and whatever.
That's
why I'm feeling sorry. I tell you what you said.
No, I understand your frustration.
But I really am. I just can't see. And who do I vote for in the next election?
Well, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, because you know where I'm coming from. But sorry, did you want to come back?
I just really just want to link in more what Sylvia was saying, and that is, I mean, especially in the light of the South Africa thing with Israel and so forth, which we not going to discuss now because we don't have time, but more the issue with international law and this thing, is it totally impotent? We know the amount of war crimes. You described the multiple conflict, you could have described multiple law. A lot of people think, well, war crimes are being committed, you might or might not argue genocide is committed in some examples, and what difference does it make? Is international law not just totally impotent, and can anything done be at all to improve it? Most of us here are extremely pessimistic. I assume you are too.
Well, I concluded many years ago, when I was first elected to Parliament, that if I ever became a cynic, that was the day to give up. And to be a politician, Michael knows this, you have to be an optimist. And it doesn't matter what you see around you, and you're absolutely right, Sylvia. It does look like a completely daunting task. But if we give up, it's never going to happen. And but there's lots of reasons for giving up, because everything's working against us, Miriam, isn't it? Everything. But I still believe in the power of the human psyche, if you like. And when I stop believing in that, I will retire from politics and from elected office anyway. You never retire from politics, but from elected office. But at the moment, at my advanced age of nearly 69, I still think there's hope. Now, how do we what are the mechanics of it? Well, it's like saying we want to reform the House of Lords, but to reform the House of Lords, we need the House of Lords to vote itself out of office. And is that ever going to happen? Well, Lloyd George showed that it could happen in history. For the United Nations veto to be got rid of, the people who've got the veto have got to agree to give up the veto and not veto giving up the veto. So you get that? But look, let's not give up on it, because human beings there's so much ingenuity in any individual, but collectively we are extraordinary. And I'm sure we can find a way. Now this sounds like the triumph of hope over experience, and it isn't, because I am experienced, and I've been disappointed enough times in my life, and losing the job that I loved so much was a massive disappointment. But I will come on to Colin just right at the end. But I don't think we can give up. We must find a way. Let's ring up Philippe Sands, one of the best experts on international law. I know the man, he's brilliant. Yeah. And there's so many people like that who've got the reading, the knowledge, the experience, the understanding, the intellect, way more than I've got. And let's, as politicians, say, we can't solve all the problems, so let's go to the experts who know much more than we do in that particular field, because we have to be good at everything, or know about everything, and probably good at nothing, apart from Michael, of course. But so let's go to the people who've got that knowledge and see whether they can find a way. Because I don't know the answer, Sylvia, but maybe they do. Martin, sorry, did I finish talking? Yeah, so that was Sylvia's comment, was on the back of that. No, don't apologise. So Debbie, defence diversification, the arms trade, the Lucas plan. Some of you might know I didn't come up on my bicycle today, I'm on my motorcycle, but I'm a great cyclist and I love my bikes and I actually build them. I have a little cellar, which I've created a workshop in my home in Pudsey, where I buy in components, and don't all rush at once to ask me to build your bike, but I will. And I do it, it's not a business, so it's just a hobby. But the reason I mention that is because the joy I get as somebody who's not trained in civil engineering or construction or manufacturing, in just putting the components together and making them work, and then creating a vehicle that can actually get me around the place, because I've still got the leg muscles and the heart available to do that, is fantastic. And it would be wonderful. I'm in touch with a startup company, I'll tell you their name, called Estali. They're based down in somewhere in the home counties. And they make folding electric bicycles, the batteries in the seat post. And they're like Bromptons, but they're much cheaper. They're made of cast aluminium. So they've got some innovation in there as well. And they've got slightly bigger wheels than the Bromptons, so they're a bit more stable. But this is the future of transport to those who are able-bodied and able to do it. And I know people in their 80s who've got Bromptons with electric motors, and they're still cruising around London on them, which is quite remarkable. But that is how you decarbonise your transport system for those who can. Not everybody can, of course. But wouldn't it be wonderful to see the arms manufacturing companies put all that effort into friction-free trains, monorails, maglev, folding bikes, electric transport, those sorts of things, because we really need it. Now, you said you were a bit disappointed about the cargo bikes you mentioned as well, and that's a really good thing too. Actually, around London now, there's more and more cargo bikes. Some have got electric assistance, some haven't, but it's a really great way of delivering. Arms export control. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but the reality is that as long as we make those arms, even a Labour government's going to want to sell them to somebody. So let's make sure that regime is as strict as possible. I'd rather we didn't sell them to anybody, but we need to win that argument. At the moment, we can actually do something to stop them going to the people that shouldn't have them. Finally, Colin. Well, I've been elected to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee again, after 13 years absence, which is great. I've also, for some reason, been elected to the Transport Committee. I did volunteer for it. So I'm on. That's why I was at Alstom yesterday. So transport and foreign affairs, quite interesting. The other interesting thing that's happened is that I said this to Starmer not long after I was sacked by him, because I had a few minutes one-to-one, and I said, one of the things that I've learned as a politician, and you must know as a lawyer and now party leader, is that your personal relationships count for an enormous amount. I mentioned Javier Figueroa, the Argentinian ambassador, introducing me to the head of the IAEA, and that was purely personal contact, because I would never have got through to him on the phone. And he said, oh yeah, no, absolutely, you're absolutely right. And because of those personal contacts, I didn't know this, by the way, until a few weeks ago, the Latin American ambassadors got together and wrote a letter to Starmer saying, why have you sacked Fabian Hamilton? We want him back, which I thought was really nice. And I decided that because there's no other shadow minister for peace and disarmament, so I'm not undermining anybody. And by the way, I still get invited to all the Latin American receptions, which is really good, because they're great fun. because there's no one else doing peace and disarmament, I've decided, well, I may not be the shadow minister, but I'm still going to do it anyway. So I don't have to have the office or the title, I'm just going to do the job. Because no one else is doing it in the Labour Party. In Parliament, plenty of Labour Party members are, but no one else in Parliament is doing this job. So I'm going to Vienna very shortly. I'm hoping to meet Raphael Grossi again. I'm going to Geneva. So Parliament does enable us to do this, which is really good, and I will report back on it. But I'm going to meet the disarmament ambassadors and organisations in Geneva. You know, the UN there has all the disarmament people based there. The Austrians have been absolutely brilliant. So have the Irish. And they're really worth talking to because they're determined. And this is, Sylvia, where we can learn. Because the Austrians and the Irish and many of the other countries that have signed up to the TPNW in Europe, not that there are many, they're not exactly, but some of the Caribbean islands, you know, the Latin Americans, for example. I mean, Brazil hasn't ratified it, but they have signed it. I don't know if they will, but Chile has. And Colombia has signed it but not ratified it, and they've now got Gustavo Petro there, who's a really progressive, radical president. Whether he'll have time to do that or not, I don't know. But, you know, Latin America being on board is really important. I think Mexico ratified it? I think they have. So I know their ambassador really well. And so the answer is, I've got a lot more freedom to say what I think, to do what I think is important for the people I represent, I'm proud to represent, to do what I think is morally right. At 69, I'm never going to be Prime Minister, or President, or Secretary of State for anything, or probably even a Minister in the government. But members of Parliament are quite privileged, and we should do what we need to do to make our world and our country a better place. And I'm not going to give up on that.
Thank you.